I hope you enjoy my conversation today with Dr. Christoph Strobel. He will be presenting here with us live on Zoom and being simulcast to our YouTube and Facebook pages. It will happen, this program is on Tuesday, October 13th, starting at 7 p.m., all about the legacies of 1620 and the Mayflower, the Native Americans of New England. It's a real pleasure to have you talk to us remotely by Zoom, and looking forward to our program together.
Thanks so much for having me, Clayton.
Of course. I was so excited to hear that you're doing this program and to get introduced and connected with you. So for folks who are curious what they're tuning into, we are going to be talking, and you're going to be presenting a program all about the history of Native Americans, specifically Native Americans here in New England. We're obviously here in 2020, 400 years after 1620, which is frequently seen, and rightly so, as a touch point between Native American and European histories with the arrival of the Pilgrims here. But before we jump into exactly what we'll be talking about, with that as a pretext, Christoph, how did you get interested in studying Native American history? You don't look, unless I'm mistaken, that you have Native American heritage yourself.
So. No, I don't. In fact, I'm an immigrant from Europe, and I studied American history here. I had a Native American friend in college, and she took me to her reservation, and so I was exposed a lot to the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois culture, and specifically the Salamanca community in New York, which is a Seneca community. And so this was kind of my segue into this type of history. Most of my serious academic work, I have done some work on immigration history, but also really my main interest is in sort of the impact of colonization on indigenous people. So I very much look at sort of the impact of Europeans on Native people. That said, when you look at these 200-300 years of colonial history, in order to understand this, you need to understand the ancient history that happened before 1620 and even 1492, because without that understanding of what indigenous societies looked like then, you don't understand the colonial period. And I also, in my teaching and also in my research, I do feel that as historians, we cannot just get stuck in the colonial period. And this was, in fact, the thing that my mentor, Neil Salisbury at Smith College, always told me is like, you got to make sure that you also bring it up to the present. And so in my teaching, but also with the last project I was working on, I was really eager to bring the history of Native peoples in New England up to the present. And sort of.
I think that's really important. I mean, so often people like to think about these, often romanticized ideals or images of what they think Native Americans are, without realizing that we are living with Native American people still today. And that they didn't all die. All our ancestors have died, but we are still living with with that history. So I'm glad you're doing that. That's a really important perspective.
Yeah, and I think this is one of the main things that the talk and the following discussion I hope will emphasize too.
So, I mean, I know that there's a very complex history here, and I don't want to get into it too much, but. I'm just curious, how do you do this work? I mean, I don't think there's a lot of written records from history pre, 1400s or 1600s, or, when does the written history start? How do you actually, as a historian, operate with this kind of material?
You become a cop-out, and you you rely on the work of others. So I studied a lot of archaeology for this project, but I also think it is important to look at indigenous histories, and that are sometimes described as oral traditions or oral histories. And so as with my work with immigrant communities, that is an important component too. You talk to people and you get different perspectives, and you look at the areas that some people describe as folklore and legends, and keep an open mind, trying to bring the archaeological record together, indigenous perspectives, and those kinds of sources, and try to interpret them. And there's a lot of interpretation going on in this work, because there's a lot that we don't know, And as I have become older and coming into my late 40s now, I have become also more accepting with the fact that the more I learn, the dumber I get.
The more we realize we don't know. Yeah.
Yes. And maybe the more I become aware of my ignorance is a better way of phrasing it.
Have you studied, so speaking of oral, and do you have a lot of local connections? Have you traveled and have a lot of community connections?
For this project, it was hard because the connections with people you have would then maybe have skewed it towards certain groups, but would have neglected others. And so I try to really be as fair throughout with the approaches and the sources, and really try to bring sort of a syncretic regional history together. So whereas when you work on the history of a specific community, this approach definitely would make a lot of sense, and in fact is probably the only way to write the history of a specific community. With this, I was a little bit reluctant to then just favor certain groups and certain voices in the narrative.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. When you're dealing with so much, there's so many peoples, and what you described there about being respectful of, kind of the complexities of the relationship between all these people. I just imagine it sounds, the more you describe it, it sounds immensely difficult, especially when you think about the materials you have available. Have there been any great surprises as you've been doing that you've unearthed that said, this is such an amazing, insight, or, what have been some of the gems that have stood out as you've been doing this work?
To me, I'm always amazed by my own ignorance with this project, and especially with the areas that I didn't know, or there's certain assumptions that you have. This is how it works in terms of federal policy in the United States, but then New England has its very own history in that is in a sense very separate from what is going on in the United States. And just give you an example, that in Massachusetts, tribes were terminated around the Civil War era and the Reconstruction era.
What do you mean terminated?
Termination means in this context that state governments pretty much said, okay, you are Native American people, no longer. We terminate your status as communities, and privatized the reservation lands, took away a lot of the reservation lands, and that is then pretty much told Narragansett, Mashpee, Wampanoags, Aquinnah, etc., you are no longer Indians or Native American, Indians or Native Americans, and here we are. And so
and that was a time when only white men, I assume, could vote, so that meant they went from having any autonomy and limited autonomy in their own spaces to having absolutely nothing.
It's complicated because some of the Native Americans actually get the right to vote through these policy decisions, but it's also clear that the Native communities in most instances did not want the autonomy, but rather wanted their communities to be preserved because it gave them local control over education. And most New England Native communities, at least in southern New England, but also in northern New England, had very functioning school systems because of the Constitution. And the only way that Native Americans show up in the Constitution is non-taxed. So there was tax protection. So Native communities didn't have to be paying for their land. There was a protection, better mechanisms that indigenous people came up to protect their private land, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so all of these systems became unraveled, and it became challenging for Native people to continue in the survival of their communities, but they did. And it's to the great qualities of many Native American activists and the perseverance of these communities that they have survived into the 20th century, and through various legal acts and political lobbying, many Native American communities in New England are now federally recognized again or are state recognized. But for many Native American communities, this also means, well, why is it the government that gets to tell us whether we're Native Americans or not? So you also have still a lot of communities that identify as indigenous, but neither state governments or federal governments say they are indigenous. And so this becomes another political issue. And so this is all a learning, and I was aware of some of these things, but doing more and more research really focused me into learning even more about this. And yeah.
So we were talking earlier about language, and as you're talking about a self-identity and kind of group identity, I know that language is frequently part of that identity. How many, are there a lot of indigenous languages that are persisting as well in all this? I'm just kind of curious as an aside to this because that would seem to me as a very natural way for people to say, oh, of course we're native, because look at this language that's unique from all these other people.
Yeah, and this is part of this history too, is that along with a lot of other traditions and the impact of colonization and living in a mainstream society, that for indigenous people, there are still efforts at indigenous language preservation. But again, it's an uphill battle, and there's a reason why a lot of indigenous languages are getting lost or our communities are really working hard to keep them going. And this is certainly this is certainly a reality in most New England communities.
Have you studied many Native American languages yourself, or do you have much exposure? I'm sure it's incredibly difficult and another field altogether, but I'm just...
Yeah, I do a little bit of the linguistic work, but again, for this project, because it was so syncretic and it draws from so many communities, I didn't include this type of work in the work because you don't want to have one group feel that they're already neglected towards another. And so I really try to be as non-group partisan as possible.
In these very partisan days, I think that's very admirable, and what we can do both to kind of emulate how do we increase our understanding while understanding all the members of our community and our complex histories. As we close, I'm sure that you'll touch on this in the program. Yeah. Go ahead, Christoph. Yeah.
Maybe also one thing to add, the point of me writing this book and the reason why I go out to give these public talks is they're not really intended for Indigenous American audiences, and I'm not telling Indigenous Americans what their history is in a particular community, but really the way I look at these types of talk is to give people in mainstream New England, Boston area, Quincy, and other places sort of an understanding and a little bit of an idea within an hour and a half program, right? To educate the public a little bit. This is what has happened in the last 500, 600, 700 years. And this is what you need to know about. In a sense, it's the idiot's guide to Native American history, and I am your idiot guide. So
we're not appropriating anybody's history. I think that's a really good point. We're not trying to pretend to be experts in somebody else or make this our own history, but we are just trying to study it and learn it. So
yes, and also in many impacts, this is what colonial processes and how mainstream societies processes, as with the policies of termination. This is the type of impact these policies have had on Indigenous people.
Well, I think that sounds like a very healthy and the perspective and the action that we can take. So I appreciate the spirit in which you're doing this. I really appreciate the knowledge that you're sharing with us. And I hope we'll get lots of people tuning in so that we can all increase our knowledge and try to find some better understanding from history about how we can apply it today. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me, and I'm looking forward to it too.
Hope you've enjoyed my conversation just now with Dr. Christoph Strobel. He will be presenting for us here live by Zoom and on YouTube and Facebook on Tuesday evening, October 13th, starting at 7 o'clock. He'll be talking all about the legacies of 1620 and the Mayflower, and specifically about the Native Americans of New England. Please join us on October 13th.